Hey guys, welcome to question of strength number 80. Um, in this podcast, really, I'm just answering your questions, but I'm also talking about a topic that either interests me or something I found out, and I think that it might interest you as well. Into your questions, which are very important because it's really the key to this podcast. Because if I don't get good questions, you don't get good answers, and it's going to be boring for everyone here. Also, if I get bad questions, you get a sarcastic answer, which is almost as fun as getting a good answer. All right. I'm a bit tired today. Just came back from my workout, which explains the slurring at the beginning. So bear with me. It will get better in the next 2 or 3 minutes once adrenaline kicks in. The topic I want to cover before we get to your questions is the topic of, let's say, deloading weeks or maintenance phases or periods of reduced training stress for various purposes, either to prevent fatigue, to fix an excessive amount of fatigue, or to resensitize your body to the training stimulus. The reason why I want to discuss that is the trend currently on social media. I was discussing that with my friend yesterday when we were training. Is that people claim, well, I never take deloads. I always train hardcore, man, because I'm so tough, right? You don't need deloads if you program properly, which I can somewhat get on board with for you, the person telling the story, because you're probably an influencer. You likely don't have a full-time job because producing content is likely your job, or maybe you do online coaching, which is actually not that demanding from a time perspective. I'm doing this myself and I know it. I'm actually living kind of that life because my business is mostly giving seminars, producing content, and selling programs. So I do have lots of free time. I don't have a 9 to 5 job like many of you have. I do have a family though, and many of these influencers don't. So that's something you need to consider when someone claims not to require any periods where they're decreasing the amount of training stress. If you have zero, like very little stress in your life, you don't have a full time job to work at, you don't have any financial stress because the biggest influencers, those that you are more likely to be reached by and influenced by, are making a very good living from what they're doing. So they have no financial stress. Most of them don't have a family or family occupation or responsibilities to take care of, or their kids are all grown up or whatever. And that changes things. That changes things a lot. I mean, it's kind of like being a pro athlete. I've trained many pro athletes in many different sports, and they can tolerate a lot more training than the average person. The reason is that they are not working 40 hours at a demanding job, either demanding physically or mentally. Many of them don't have kids yet, and a lot of them don't have any like stable long-term relationship. So really, most of the stress can actually come from the training session. Now, all stress is handled pretty much the same way by the body. It's a stress response, detailed by Anne Stilley. And so basically, it's accumulation of all stresses that tells if the body can like improve, decrease, maintains, or whatever. So a higher amount of external stress from your job, from your responsibilities, financial issues, relationship stress, all pile on. And the more of that you have, the less of the training stress you can have. So if you have a very easy life, then of course you probably do not need deloads, especially if you're training more like a bodybuilder. And again, I'm not making fun of bodybuilders. I'm training like a bodybuilder a lot of time myself. I've done it myself. I have trained bodybuilders. I respect that. I mean, especially when it comes to diet, these guys work really hard. But the reality is that compared to like Olympic athletes or pro athletes, the training that a bodybuilder does is very easy on a system. Okay. Let's say even if you're lifting for hypertrophy, let's say 5 days a week, an hour and a half per day, that's not even 10 hours per week. Compare that to pro athletes. If you combine the lifting, the conditioning, the mobility work, the power work, the technical practices, sometimes it can go as high as 20, 30 hours a week. I've known Olympic athletes who were training 40 hours a week. So certainly you will not likely overtrain if you're training like 5 hours a week, even if you're hardcore and going to failure, bro, right? It's not likely to happen. So yeah, you probably do not need deloads or weeks off if you are an influencer, if you don't have any external stressors, and if you're training mostly like a bodybuilder. Okay, that doesn't mean that nobody does, because the message here they're saying is that essentially, if you need a deload, it's that you're not training properly, that you are, or you're weak. Okay, so you're inferior. So that's a bad message to send. Some people really do need deload. Now, personally, I'm not a huge fan of planned deloads during a training cycle. Okay. For example, the good old pattern of training hard for 3 weeks, then taking a deload, training hard for 3 weeks, taking a deload, which is probably the most common way of integrating a deload week into a program. I'm not a fan of that. Okay. It comes from the world, and I get it. Okay? You absolutely don't want your athletes to overtrain off season. But from training athletes, what I always noticed when we did that pattern is that the deload week essentially became a completely non-productive week. Because it was a deload week, the athletes just thought that, okay, today is easy week. And not only they do less volume because the decrease in volume was plenty, they actually were not focused on training hard on those sets. So they might actually sometimes regress during that week and certainly not progress. So if you have, for example, a hockey player who has 12 weeks to prepare during the off season, you have 3 blocks, so you have three um, weeks. You're literally losing 3 weeks of training out of 12. So 25% less training stimulus than you can normally have if you don't take those deloads. Okay? However, I am a fan of deloads in two situations. The first situation, when you need, can either be due to errors in programming. Maybe you program too much work. Maybe you misevaluated volume or how much training or how much training stress someone can take because you didn't evaluate properly their lifestyle or their external sources of stress or their physiology. Okay, and that can often happen when you start working with them. Okay? You don't know them well enough to understand their volume tolerance. I'm going to give you an example. I was training with this bobsleigh athlete, and I was when I started using training him, I was using the same template I was using with another bobsleigh athlete, which I figured, well, same sport, basically the same lifts, same strength level, same power level, so it should work pretty well. The guy got burned out completely after 2 weeks of training. Turns out that he could only tolerate 6 to 9 work sets per workout. More than that, is all of his performance markers would go down and he would just crash. Okay? So he could tolerate 6 to 9 work sessions 3 times a week. Compare that to the other guy I mentioned, the other boxing guy who could tolerate literally 3 times the amount of work, sometimes four. So you have to know someone, and that can lead to mistakes. And then to start over or to fix the mistake, you might need to take a deload week. So you need to keep that in your back pocket just in case you need it. The other situation I like it is at the end of a training cycle. And the training cycle, it's typically a period of, let's say, 12 to 16 weeks, okay, in which the training stress should gradually be increased because that's how a training cycle should be designed. If you want to make optimal progress through the course of the whole training cycle, you need to increase the training stress. Maybe not every week, but certainly throughout the course of the cycle. The reason is that the body adapts to a certain level of stress. That's what adaptation is. You impose a stress on the body, which is a stress, and the body will adapt to be better at facing that stress. The better you are at facing that stress, the less the stress causes a need to further adapt. See what I mean? So if you have a certain level of stress, at first it might cause significant improvement. But every time you repeat the same level of stress, it gives you a little bit less, a little bit less, a little bit less, until it actually becomes almost a medium slope. So to keep progressing, you need to gradually increase the training stress over the course of your training cycle. That can either be accomplished by adding volume, it can be accomplished by adding weight, it could be accomplished by using more complex methods or other or switching to more demanding exercises. But certainly there is a progression in the amount of stress from the beginning to the end of the cycle. So that at the end of the cycle, you're in a situation where you're basically imposing almost the maximum amount of stress that the body can tolerate and still recover positively from. Okay, so once you reach that point, understand that your body adapts to the level of stress. So if you are at the highest level you can tolerate, okay, and you need to keep increasing it, otherwise you just stop progressing. You have two choices: either you try to bang your head against the wall and try to inch every little bit of progress you can get until the training stops working, and that normally backfires. You can actually try to keep increasing the training stress, and then you're in the zone where the body might actually negatively adapt and injuries occur, fatigue, burnout, and stuff like that. Or you can start a new training cycle. Okay? But if you start a new training cycle right away, and remember, the training cycle would start from a lower point because you can do more. So you start from a lower point and you still keep progressing. If you go taper between both, uh, literally the first 2 or 3 or 4 weeks of the cycle will be completely ineffective because the training stimulus will be much lower than where you ended the last cycle. So that's why I like to use a maintenance period, a period I use to resensitize the body to the training stimulation. And that can last anywhere between 2 and 4 weeks, depending on the strategy you're using. Either completely forgetting about lifting and just doing other stuff like mobility, like conditioning, like sprinting, like plyometrics, like jumps, anything, playing sports, anything but lifting weights. Or and that if you use a strategy, 2 weeks should suffice. If you want to keep lifting, what you can do is decrease to around 1/4 to 1/3 of the average volume of the previous cycle. That's the minimum dose that will maintain all your gains, but it's low enough to resensitize yourself. Don't expect gains during that period. It's seen as a period where you fix all the real aches and pains you have. If you're using steroids, you try to regulate your body. If you have injuries, try to fix them. Just recover, work on mobility, work on things you might not have developed during the training cycle. Then, after that, those 3 or 4 weeks, your body will now be responsive again to a training stimulus. So you don't have to start at a very high point. You can start slightly higher than the beginning of the previous cycle, but not all the way up. And then you just work your way up gradually. And after every 12-week cycle, you're going to have that maintenance period. It just makes physiological sense. I'm not a guy who like to use a lot of deloads, but saying that you never need deloads, in my opinion, is sending the wrong message. Sure, if you have a low stress level in your life, if you have no full time job, you're an influencer, you make lots of money just posting one video per day and answering comments and doing online coaching. Maybe you don't have any family to take care of, and you're training more like a bodybuilder, which is not that stressful compared to the more demanding training of athletes and stuff like that. Yeah, you probably don't need deloads, but you still should have periods where you resensitize your body to training stress after a pretty long training. All right, let's get to your questions. When I walked in, there was already a good number of questions. So don't hesitate to put any new questions in the top chat, and hopefully we'll get all of your questions. What are your thoughts on a push pull leg and power split? What is the best way to structure it? As I'm like partially answered you in my Instagram feed, I really like that approach. I think that's a very good mix between hypertrophy and power, and it does not go against the more concentrated training approach. When I'm using a more concentrated approach, focusing on one quality, we still have room for a second quality, which is done at roughly 1/3 of the volume, which is the ratio you have right now. It's pretty good. Like so, the push pull leg would allow you to get plenty of hypertrophy or strength, depending on how you want to structure it. And the power day could allow you to improve both power and strength. You can actually put strength there. When I do my power day, one thing I like to do is doing a complex of a strength lift and a power lift or an explosive movement. So, for example, it could be a back squat complex with a jump squat, or complex with a depth jump. For example, a bench press complex with a medicine ball throw. A complex, of course, is not a superset. You have a rest period with exercise. You do squats, rest 2 or 3 minutes. Then you do your jump squat, rest 2 or 3 minutes, and then get back to squat. So that actually like doubles down as a strength and power day. You can even use a multi-point complex. So, for example, strength movement, strength speed movement, and reactive exercise. For example, you could be doing, let's say, a Romanian deadlift, power snatch from the hang, and broad jumps, for example, broad jump series. So that is also another possibility. So it's more power bias, but there's still some strength in there because strength is a component of power. So you can actually put it there. I personally would put that day first in the week, especially again, it depends on. Okay, I would put the power day where you are the freshest. So, for example, I personally like to use with clients Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday. The easiest workout is Saturday. The hardest is on Monday. The reason for that is that most people work weekdays, Monday, Friday. So it's not just the training stress that you're looking at. It's the whole stress. So most people on Monday they will be fresher than Friday when they have their work week behind them. Okay, so putting the hardest workout on Friday or even worse on Saturday typically doesn't yield the best possible result. Like most people will rest during the weekend, so putting the biggest workout on Monday makes sense. You have a day off on Saturday, on Sunday, so you are refreshed, you are better recovered, and you're beginning your week, so you're mentally, psychologically rested. Now, of course, if you have a different schedule, you will put your workouts otherwise. Also, for example, myself, my toughest days are actually weekends because my work it doesn't have a precise schedule, so I'm working just as much during the weekends, especially if I'm getting a seminar. But also because during the weekends my kids don't have school, so for the whole day we have to do family activities. We take care of the kids, so it's more actually more work, or let's say more stress than during the weekdays. So I would put probably my biggest workout something like a Wednesday or a Thursday, depending on my schedule. But yeah, I really like what does a polykin upper and lower body structural balance get right, and what does it do wrong? First of all, I haven't used structural balance in years because I never found it to be particularly useful, especially for the upper body. I kind of like the use of was it the tap no, the tap test the tap test, but, the clap test, yeah, the clap test for lower body. I kind of liked it because it did give me some clues. But I personally prefer to go with body structure. So, for example, as the primary tool to evaluate muscle imbalances, some people like longer legs, especially if you have a longer femur, will make you more posterior chain biased. For example, if you have shorter legs and a longer tibia, it will put you in a more quadricep biased situation. So that gives you more clues. I also like to look at the vertical jump and the strategy instinctively used by the individual. So, for example, I'm looking at the torso angle when they're jumping. Are they doing a lot of hinging, or it's more quadriceps, or it's more upright? Or is it just just lower back putting their body up? So that tells me a lot. Is it posterior chain dominant? Is it inferior chain dominant? I'm also looking at if the knees are caving in when they're landing, or even if when they're jumping. That also gives me clues about maybe strength, uh, lagging strength or imbalances in either the VMO or the glute, depending on the strategy they're using. So, for example, if I'm using a more upright posture when jumping, which is anterior chain dominant, and the knees cave in, it's probably a glute imbalance. If I'm using more of a posterior chain, so more of a hip hinge action when jumping, and the knees cave in, it's probably weak VMO. So that gives me just as much information as the CLAT test, and it's, in my opinion, easier to use. Plus, you can actually use the test itself as to measure power output. As far as the upper body is concerned, the problem is that it does not take into consideration levers. So, for example, the trap three exercise is heavily influenced by the length of your arm. I could never be strong at the trap three, even if I have amazingly strong lower trap. My old trapezius and upper back is super strong. Okay? Uh, rear delt is decent, but I can never perform the trap three with any kind of weight because it's on my movement. If you have longer arms, it's even worse because now you have that wrong lever. I'm not a big fan of that because there's also a lot of compensation, which many coaches don't see. External rotation, I just think that the old rotator cuff thing is overblown. I mentioned that I think 2 weeks ago when I talked about stabilizers. There's no such thing as stabilizers. So yeah, yes, they could be an imbalance in rotator cuff strength, but testing like that, I've never seen someone on the polykin structural balance who actually had sufficient rotator cuff strength based on the ratio we had. And also, why test biceps? Because the structural balance test tests biceps and then it tests closed grip bench. Supposedly to measure the flexor and extensor ratio, but now why not pick the closed grip chin up, for example? or if you're testing biceps, go with a pure tricep exercise. To me, it just feels like Charles went with exercise that he liked himself and that he liked to use with athletes and use those to create a test, an assessment. And they are probably not the best ways to assess an athlete's balance. When I do leaning 45-degree side leg lift, my left side gets exhausted faster than the right side. Could there be a deeper issue like hip or quadratus lumborum imbalance? It can be. It can be that. It can be oblique. It can be abductors, adductors. Honestly, without seeing what it actually looks like, it's very hard for me to give you an evaluation. The reason is that even if like one side is harder, well, what does happen at that point? Are you twisting? Is it just keeping the same posture but it's harder? Where do you feel it getting harder? It's really, really hard to give you a precise evaluation. So without seeing you, I really can't comment. But yes, it could be an issue with Mondragis Tambora. Been having 3 sets of 10 to 15 reps of those leading 45 side raises after every workout. Is this exercise like face pull for the hips? First, I'm not in on the face pull is something that like the daily pill for shoulder health thing. I'm just not. I'm not saying that the face pull is not a good movement, but doing them every day, especially with high reps, is just accumulating lots of mechanical work that does actually cause friction and inflammation in that joint. And yes, the muscle gains you get from it can help, but the whole overuse syndrome can happen. I remember talking with Dave Tate about something like this, and he mentioned that when he was starting to have hip problems, he started doing a boatload of those, like just body weight, hip circles, and 45-degree raises, and all those corrective exercises we see, and it just got worse. The reason is that even though it's low intensity, it's still mechanical work. There's still some joint friction. You're still like rolling the joint, the ball of the joint in that joint. So it creates a lot of stress. By itself, if you use it at the right frequency and right volume, it can definitely help. But if you do too much, that amount of movement just pile up and can create joint issue that makes things worse. And to me, the baseball is in that category also. It's not something I would recommend doing twice a week, and probably using two different variations of baseball each time. So again, same thing with the leg lift. And I get you because if you have an issue, for example, it's something you will want to. I'm personally, if I find a problem on my body, I want to fix it right now. So I will tend to be excessive in my application of corrective strategies, and it often backfires. You need to discipline yourself. It's a movement that can be helpful, but just because it's easier, it's unloaded, doesn't mean that doing it every day will not have any issues. What are your thoughts on protein powder with these ingredients? Whole food protein blend of beef, protein isolate, pea protein, chicken protein, egg albumin, salmon, brown rice protein. Why don't you just go with good old whey protein? I mean, uh, is it because of an intolerance issue? Um, some people just because they would say, "Ah, that's from whole food, so it's better." No, it's not. Whey protein has the highest availability of all proteins. It's like 95% available. Uh, so any other protein, even if it was a little bit better, which is not, you don't really get more amino acids than whey protein. That's just a fancy thing because the reality of the supplement world is that every company sells protein. And all the protein is basically whey concentrate or whey isolate. So that's like 85% of the protein market. So to be able to be competitive, you can either have uh, like the best product, and that sadly often comes down to taste, or if you want to have a better chance, you can actually create a product that is different than what everybody is doing. It might not be better, but because it's different, you will attract some clients. Because, hey, I'm going to try this one. It might be better because it's different, right? But the reality is, it's not. Now, the only benefit of having all of those blends together is that you might have a better total amino acid profile because each protein source does have a slightly different ratio of the various aminos. So that might be it. Uh, but you will not get more anabolism from it. You will not get uh, better effect, especially if you actually have solid protein foods in your diet. So I would just go with the probably less expensive whey protein. Hi, coach. Getting ready for golf off season, November to March in New York. What do you think about doing 1 month blocks in this order? Strength hypertrophy, block one; strength speed, block two; speed strength, block three; speed and power, block four. It makes sense on paper, but it's probably not going to be super effective uh, because you have a short period to get ready. So, for example, if you're doing strength hypertrophy, well, 4 weeks, especially if you're getting back into training, you probably didn't train as much during the off season. 4 weeks to build muscle and strength is a very short time. Very short time. At best, you will get back to the previous levels you were at if you lost some muscle and strength during the season from not training as much. Okay, uh, so that's very very short. Uh, and strength speed. Well, first, strength speed does also depend on strength. So you should actually train strength in the same block as strength speed for better effect. Speed strength and speed and power should be together because it's the same thing. That's not how I would program. Okay, that's not how I would program. The way I program with athletes is more it's more general than that. It's not I'm going to train one physical capacity per block. That can be done. Okay, that's concentrated loading. That can be done if you have a long period of time to prepare. If you're a football player, you have a 6 months off season. Same thing with baseball. You have a 6 months, 7 months off season. You can absolutely do a phase of hypertrophy and strength. In fact, you can have a phase of hypertrophy because you have enough time to get a decent stimulus from each block. Okay, but if you only have like 12 weeks, you cannot afford to spend only 4 weeks to be, on one capacity, 4 weeks on one capacity, 4 weeks on one capacity. First of all, because there's a limited amount of progress you can make in 4 weeks in any given capacity. And then if you stop training it will regress gradually. So at the end of your training cycle, your strength is probably back to where it was before at the beginning of the cycle, okay? Because you didn't hit strength for the last three blocks. So that would be the main issue. So what I personally do in that situation is more of a concurrent approach. So for example, and I'm going to explain exactly how I structure the training of athletes when I have a shorter off season. Um, I will use a whole body approach, 3 days a week for a big workout and one smaller workout. The first day is for strength. Second day, so Monday is strength. Wednesday is speed strength or related capacities. And Friday is strength speed. Okay. And then on Saturday, we would do more hypertrophy work for lagging muscle. Okay. That would be the hypertrophy day. Now, there would be a periodization uh, from block to block in those 12 weeks. So, for example, the strength day could start actually more like a hybrid strength hypertrophy of 6 to 8 reps, for example. It would include a greater number of exercises and probably more isolated movement. Then, if you take that strength day at the second block, it could become more just basic strength building oriented. The best zone to gain strength, is to build strength, would be 4 to 6 reps, sets of 4 to 6 reps. Then you would have the third block, which would be more of the strength demonstration, so very neurological, so probably sets of let's say 3 reps. I don't like to go lower than three for athletes, but or could be using methods like clusters, which is what I really like in that phase. And then the last phase, the strength work actually becomes a second strength speed in the form of complexes. To be one strength movement in what I call the accentuated method. Accentuation refers to using the range of movement mostly used in your sport. So, for example, if you're playing golf, you're really never going lower than, let's say, depending on how you're using your lower body in the swing, you don't really go lower than a 100-degree knee angle, kind of like a shot putter. Uh, so you would do squats or deadlifts in a range that the knee never goes below 100 degrees. That would allow you to use more weight, but in a sport specific range. Okay. Uh, Actually, was a study published and showing that partial squats actually improve vertical jumping and sprinting better in full squat. So I put that in that phase. And it would be complex with an explosive movement. So if you're doing a squat, it could become a jump squat. If you're doing a pin pull or a Romanian deadlift, it could become a broad jump, something like that. Okay? You can go with more specific movement. And we would have the second day of the week, which would be the speed strength day. Speed strength day would be what I really like on that day is actually complexes of over speed swings along with power movements. So earlier in the preparation phase, so for example, the first block or even the first two blocks, you would do a complex where you actually start with the power exercise and then you switch, you complex. The second exercise would be over speed swings. I use the super speed sticks, but you can use any device that allows you to do over speed work. Now you can also do slightly overloaded work. Like for example, with the super speed system, you have three different sticks. Uh, the green one is like I think it's, don't quote me on this, 10% lighter than the regular driver. The blue is roughly the same weight as the regular driver, and the red stick is a bit heavier. So the green one will allow you the greatest over speed, and that should be done if you have should be used to work on your swing speed. If you have a very good sequencing, okay, doing over speed swing with a stick that's too light. Yeah, so if you have bad sequencing, you're someone who tends to overuse their arms and the lower body is not firing first, the very high over speeds, the lightest sticks will tend to give you more arm speed, but will not work on lower body speed. So it will just amplify your problems. So you can only use those the lighter sticks if you have very good sequencing, which is why a lot of pros report good improvement with overswing speeds, whereas amateurs oftentimes don't get anything. The heavier stick, like the red one, which is heavier than the driver, should be used by people who have poor sequencing because your arms are holding the weight, your hands are holding the weight. It actually slows down your arms, allowing your hips and legs to be in better sequence. But that's beside the point. So the point would be to do, for example, a power exercise could be, and it doesn't have to be sport specific. It could be a power clean from the hang, power snatch from the hang, trap bar jump squat, something like that, and then you would go with the overswing speed over speed swings. Then and you can also obviously have other form of plyometrics. I really like side skater jumps. It transfers very well to golf swing. But it could also just be vertical jump, medicine ball throws, and stuff like that. The key with that day is that the more you progress from block to block, the more specific the power movement becomes. So the first two blocks, the power exercises can be very, very general. It could be just something where you move fast. It can be a power clean from the hang, power snatch from the hang, a push press, a push jerk, a power jerk. It could be a medicine ball throw from various directions. It could be vertical jumps, could be depth jumps, could be broad jumps, could be side to side jumps, doesn't really matter as long as it's done fast. But as you progress through the blocks, the last two blocks should use a more specific power movement. So it could be more like a medicine ball rotational throw, making sure you keep the good sequencing with the lower body doesn't. The biggest problem with medicine ball throws, rotational throws, is that people tend to be out of sequence and throw with their upper body and not fire the hips. So you need to have proper sequencing. That could be an example. It could be, again, side to side jumps. It could be rotational jumps. So you jump and you try to do 180 degrees jump in the air or 360. You can do those with added weight also. But now in the last two phases, I would actually start the complex with the overspeed swing. Then 2 minutes rest. Then you do your power movement. The third day would be your strength speed day, which would be just explosive movement done with, and you would just progress in the methods with it. That would be, to me, a better approach because you are training all physical capacities in the whole 12 or 16 weeks, depending on how much you have. So you have no degradation. And at the end, everything is maxed out. So you can have a much better transfer. For people with low baseline dopamine, we can get highly addicted, that's not why you get addicted. I'm going to get to that after more. I'm going to read your questions and I'm going to correct you on something. Who can get highly addicted? How do you optimize dopamine? Because we live in a society where you have to use cell phone, social media. So basically, okay, type 2Bs don't have necessarily low baseline dopamine. They're just normally very sensitive to dopamine, and then they also have high serotonin and high acetylcholine. It's really what makes a 1B is really more the acetylcholine and the serotonin. So let's not look at the neurotype right now. Let's just look at dopamine itself. Now, the biggest issue with dopamine is that we have tons of stimuli in our modern life that provide a much greater dopamine response than accomplishing a goal ever would. Because that's the purpose of dopamine. Dopamine, people like to call it the pleasure neurotransmitter. Yeah, but it's not the main goal. It's really a survival and let's say procreation neurotransmitter. Basically, it reinforces positive behaviors that are, let's just say, conducive to increasing your likelihood of surviving when we were cavemen and stuff like that. So if we had a task to do and we completed the task, we had to work hard for it, we get a brain reward to program you to work hard because it was needed for survival. When you have a sexual relationship, you have a big boost in dopamine because the nature wants you to want to procreate to be able to for the species to survive. Okay, but in our modern world, the thing is that it works by a positive reward mechanism. Dopamine, when it's bound to receptors, it gives you a pleasure response, and you want to do that again. Now, let's say just say 30 years ago, that was all fine and well because there were no extremely strong or very few extremely strong dopamine stimuli that could target the receptors without you having to work for it. So people were more resilient. People were more self-motivated because they didn't need any extra push because their dopamine receptors were super sensitive to the dopamine, so that they would get from accomplishing a goal or doing something positive. Now, nowadays, if you look at, for example, a video game, I don't know the ratio, but the amount of dopamine stimulation, the receptors being stimulated, is so much higher than anything you can get in nature, even when you have sex. Okay, the video game first, there's the excitement of the game itself. There's the accomplishment of a goal, even though it's just a goal on the screen, and there's the blue light that is very highly dopaminergic. Okay, and that gives you a monster stimulus that your body just can't handle. And there's no goal that you will accomplish in real life that you have to work hard for that will give you anywhere close to that pleasure response. So why would you make an effort to accomplish something when you can have just the same satisfaction by just being dead in front of a TV? Okay, so that's the biggest issue. Yeah, all those screens are all around us, and that's true. But it's still up to you to minimize utilization. I mean, you get highly addicted. Well, don't put yourself in a situation to become addicted. I know it sounds like an asshole comment, but that's really what it is. I mean, you cannot change the fact that we have TVs, laptops, cell phones everywhere, but you can certainly change the fact that you are looking at your phone every 5 minutes or spending 3 hours a day in front of a TV or whatever. Okay, of course, if you have to work on it, that's different. But just try to minimize screen time. That will do wonders. And if you find yourself in a situation where you can actually cut yourself completely from those stimuli for a week, let's say you go on vacation, that will do wonders to reestablish your dopamine sensitivity. When I do standing, when I do standing overhead presses, I create a shoulder shell. Yeah, like you said in one of your videos. What other shoulder exercise can I do? What do you mean? What other exercise can you do from that position? Because why do you mention creating a shoulder shelf, like you said in one of your videos? What are, or you're just asking for other shoulder movement? Well, it depends on your goal. Are you more strength related? Is your goal mostly strength, or is it more building muscle? Because if you're trying to build muscle, that I would only have one overhead press lift in your week. I mean, that will hit mostly the anterior deltoid, so you don't need a second pressing exercise. I mean, I actually talked about that in a forum answer on T Nation. People were asking, well, what second overhead press exercise can I add in the workout? Well, you really don't need to if your goal is hypertrophy, because it will just be redundancy. It will just hit the muscle pretty much the same way. If you do in, overhead barbell press, if you do push press, if you do dumbbell press, it hits the muscle pretty much the same way. So what you're looking for, and it's going to hit mostly the interior deltoid. So if you're shooting for hypertrophy, you should add work for the medial head of the deltoid and the real portion of the deltoid. So that means lateral raises on machines, on pulleys, on dumbbells, whatever. But that actually should be the bulk of your shoulder training. You should only have one big pressing movement. If your goal is hypertrophy, if your goal is strength, I can see the use of two overhead movement, but using one of these overhead movements as an overload exercise, because the military press is weak from the bottom to the eyes. Okay, so that is what is limiting the amount of weight you can lift. So if you find a way to bypass that, either by doing a push press, so using leg momentum to get the bar from here to here, so you can use more weight, it can overload the later portion of the movement, which can eventually help you lift more weight and overload the muscles better. You can also do partial pin press, so you have using the pins at your high level and you're pressing from that position. Same thing will overload the second half of the range of motion. Uh, if you're more power oriented, you can do muscle clean and presses or muscle snatches. But if you're just trying to build muscle, I would just you do one overhead movement, and the rest would be more lateral raises and movements. Don't forget that the interior deltoid is also being worked quite a bit when you do bench presses and incline presses. In fact, I would argue that the incline bench press is more of a shoulder exercise than a pectoral exercise. So that piles up over the course of the week. In a general strength hypertrophy program, would a seated overhead press or incline bench be better? Incline bench. First, a seated overhead press is asking for trouble. You are unracking the bar behind you and bring it forward, and you have to bring it back. And oftentimes it just leads to cheating by pushing your hips forward and overarching your back, which actually just become an incline press. So might as well just do an incline bench press. The incline bench press, as I just mentioned, I didn't read your question before answering. It's probably more of a deltoid exercise than a chest movement. I would still use probably a slightly higher incline, just to put you in a more shoulder dominant position. So, for example, the traditional bench for an incline press is 30 degrees. I would use probably 45 or maybe 60 degrees, but that still puts you in a better position to press overhead. You're going to use more weight and you're still focusing on the delts just as much, so you have better stimulus. I use isolated pea protein, it's much cleaner. What do you mean by cleaner? I mean, any isolated protein, regardless of what the source is just as clean. That's what isolate is. It's just the protein. So there's nothing, there's no crap in there, there's no filler or whatever. So no, protein, isolated pea protein is not better or cleaner than isolated whey protein. It might be cleaner than concentrated whey protein because the process to get the protein is less filtration. But any isolated protein uh, would be just as clean. An isolated whey protein would have a much, much, much better amino acid profile than pea protein, which would be incomplete. Because typically, and that's the one drawback of uh, veganism, is that no single protein source that is vegan has a sufficient amount of all of the amino acids. Okay, it's always incomplete. So that's why those who are successfully using a vegan diet are combining foods to, at the end of the day, they have sufficient amount of all the amino acids. So pea protein is inferior to whey. Now, isolated is what you say cleaner than concentrate. That's a fact. But it's not because it's pea protein that it's cleaner. It's because it's isolated. And you have isolated whey protein, you have isolated casein protein, which both would be far, far superior to pea protein, just from an amino acid profile standpoint. I'm usually able to deadlift my 5 by 5 weight of 385. Today went with grip strength test. I barely was able to lift 365 and 385 for one. What happened? My grip strength didn't drop. Yeah, but it can be some muscles that are not fully recovered. I mean, especially a deadlift. A deadlift is such a leverage lift that it doesn't. And the main benefit of a deadlift is that it trains or involves many different movements at the same time. Okay, but that's also its drawback because if there's any one muscle that is involved that is slightly weaker, performance will be affected. Okay, compare that to a slightly similar movement, the squat. Typically, the squat is a lot less variable because yeah, you have more muscles involved, but it's really mostly quads and some glutes, of course, depending on your own lever. But deadlift, you have glutes, you have quads, you have hamstrings, you have adductors, and so on and so forth. Uh, Upper back, traps, lats. So you only it only takes one of those muscles to be slightly under recovered to affect performance. That's why the deadlift is a very irregular movement when it comes to strength. So I wouldn't really not stress out about this. Hey coach, hope you're doing well. I'm doing decent, thank you. Do you believe in muscle hyperplasia? I do. If so, how would you go about achieving it? You don't do anything special. It's just something that happens when you have maxed out your hypertrophy for fiber. At least that's what I personally believe. There was some data originally that long term loaded stretching, which, by the way, I'm a firm believer of, I'm a big believer in loaded stretching, cause more muscle hyperplasia. But those studies were done on rats, which doesn't mean they are not significant, but it was also done for like stretching a muscle that was denervated. So they actually removed the muscle for something like 24 hours straight. So it's not really applicable to anything we do in gyms. So maybe loaded stretching can provide better hyperplasia, or maybe it was just the extreme stress that did it. Okay. What I personally believe is that muscle plasia, hyperplasia, which is essentially taking a fiber and splitting it in two and rebuilding both with the available satellite cells would occur mostly when the growth potential of a fiber is achieved and you're still imposing further growth stimulus on it, which would take years to occur. That's why when you look at humans, the indirect evidence of hyperplasia is all on very advanced athletes. It's probably like an adaptation that takes place once someone is close to his natural hypertrophy limit. Can you explain the athlete that can eat one meal a day and bag a candy and still be shredded like that receiver from the Seattle Seahawks? Okay, first, he probably does not eat like that. He might be doing it once in a while. That is likely not his regular diet. But then again, I've seen some freaks, dude. These guys are just genetic phenoms. I remember when I was in St. Louis, we worked with Steven Jackson, who was an all-pro running back. The guy walked in. He was 6'2". He was 235, muscular and freaking lean, and he didn't train. Like his training was essentially doing push-ups sometimes and running. And he told us, if I lift weights, I just get too big. I mean, some people are just born like that. Heck, I've seen coke addicts on the street who are more muscular, leaner, more vascular than most people in gyms, and these are like homeless people. So genetic is a bitch. It just there are some of these people who are just freaks, and they are just built to carry muscle, so they don't lose muscle even if they don't eat much. That's just the way they're built. Okay, that's their natural setting. I mean, I've seen a guy who did not train bench press 425 pounds for 12 reps, and that guy did not train. So these guys exist. A friend of mine, when I was in high school, could have stepped on a bodybuilding stage right now and win the middle weight. I think it was like 176. But he never lifted a weight in his life. These guys happen. So if that's his natural state, even if his nutrition is deficient, that's the way he is. That's the way his body is built. He will just stay like that. So that happens. So that is a free. And what I will tell you is that when it comes to muscle strength and power, especially muscle and power, the best genetic freaks are playing American football, either at the top college programs or in the pros. All the biggest freaks I've seen were all in that category, were all playing American football. So that's just what it is. I mean, that's just a genetic freak. The guy would probably be something like 225 pounds, freaking lean, without even lifting a weight. Like you had Herschel Walker, was extremely muscular, extremely fast. All he did was push ups, sit ups, and sprinting. You have these guys. These guys exist. You have guys who are just freaking big, freaking muscular, and they barely eat and barely and they don't lift. That happens. They're just built like that. Advice for strengthening for combat sport. Honestly, it's not really my area of expertise at the moment because I just started myself doing combat sports in the form of MMA and boxing. I will actually become more and more and more interested in that form of training. But right now, my advice would actually be very, very general and probably not that reliable. Uh, so if you ask me that questions in 3 months, I would likely have a much better answer. Sorry if I can't really help you right now. The one thing I would say is I really like Zercher squat and Zercher deadlift. I really like loaded carries, and I really like also a variation of the power variation of the Olympic lifts. So these three movements would certainly be in my toolbox. Are there methods? Are there methods to build a lactate blood threshold? I hear soccer players have the highest levels. Okay, that's two different things here. The capacity to tolerate lactate and the amount of lactate you produce is two different things. I believe that training to minimize lactate production is not something that you train for and probably not that effective because lactate itself can actually be recycled to form new glucose. So producing lactate is actually a good thing if you are a soccer player or an endurance athlete because the more lactate you produce, provided that it does not hurt your performance, the more it can recycle to produce more glycogen, giving you more fuel. Okay. Now, being able to tolerate lactate is a different story. And what tolerating lactate is? It's simply becoming desensitized to the signals sent to the nervous system when you have that lactate and hydrogen ions accumulation. First, you need to understand that lactate itself is not debilitating. It's the hydrogen ions that are released with lactate that makes that burning sensation and hurts performance. Now, the pain sensation is essentially just something, an information is sent to your brain to prevent you from hurting yourself. We talked like many times. I talked about central fatigue. Central fatigue is what? It's a weakening of the central nervous drive to the muscle. The weaker it is, the harder it is to recruit a fast twitch fiber and produce more force and produce more effort. So if you have enough of those pain signal, you will send a weaker and weaker and weaker signal, actually preventing you from doing a movement that your body perceives as being dangerous, right? So those main signals that create central fatigue are discomfort, pain, and perception of effort. Discomfort from weather, temperature, stuff like that also plays a small role. Okay, so the thing is that you can make yourself less sensitive to the signal. So it's still there. The lactate, the hydrogen ions are still there, and it's still sending a signal to the brain. But the brain, being used to it, does not interpret it as something dangerous, something debilitating. So the perception of pain is much lower, and it does not cause central fatigue as much. So it does not decrease performance. That's what we want. Okay. The analogy I always use is if you start working in a factory, let's say that produces paper mill. Paper mill is super noisy. You get in there, your ears will have the time of their life. That's for sure. So it's unbearable. For the first week, you go home, you're super tired, your ears hurt, your head hurts. But after a month of that, it's like you don't notice it anymore. It's still there. You can still hear the noise, but it does not bother you anymore because you are adapted. You are desensitized to it. Same thing. The more time and the more times you spend under that state of high lactate and hydrogen ions, the less it will impact performance and you will start to feel it less and less and less. So it's really a matter of just training in that lactate zone. So in that lactic zone, the more time you can spend there, the better it is. What I did with CrossFit athletes when I wanted to increase their tolerance to lactate was train in a zone where lactate would start to accumulate, so it starts to burn, and just go up to the point where it starts to feel a bit too much. Not it's not debilitating yet, but you feel it. Then you rest. And you rest just long enough to start again to not feel the pain that much anymore, and then you build up, you build up, you build up. And when it becomes close to being unbearable, you rest a little bit. Resting might be like 30 seconds. Okay? And the longer you can go like that, the more time you spend in that lactate zone, the more you can desensitize yourself to it. You do that for a few weeks, even months, and then you will become a lot less affected by lactate. Follow up on the deadlift question. I did heavy back and metabolic reps workout the day before. It just did well. Yeah, there you go. People think that the deadlift is mostly a lower body movement. I would argue it's mostly an upper body exercise. Uh, well, of course, the lower body is moving the weight, the hips and legs, but really, what the make or break factor is the tightness of the lats, the traps, and the lower back that just locks everything in. For example, when someone's running their lower back on deadlift, okay, you start to lift the weight from the floor and the lower back rounds, people will assume that it's weak lower back or weak core. No, it's just that your lats are not locked in. If you lock in your lats, it's almost impossible to round the lower back. So if your lats, your upper back and traps are tired, deadlifting will be much harder because you just can't maintain an optimal position to transfer the strength to the bar. Because yes, the legs are pushing down on the floor, but the force needs to be applied to the bar. So that means that the force needs to go through the upper body to be transferred to that barbell. How much protein per day should I type 3 have? Around 1 gram per pound. That's not different than anybody. Considering they are also high carb. It doesn't really matter. Protein will not be stored as fat. So when I program a diet, for example, I actually count protein separately than the other nutrients. So I don't like to use a caloric requirement formula. I just need to go by trial and error. But I always count the calories from energy nutrients like carbs and fat separately in protein because protein will not be converted to fat. Very, very tough to convert it. So even if you have high protein, it doesn't mean you need to consume less carbs, otherwise you get fat. Yeah, I feel that I was actually going to mention him. I really like what he's doing. Actually, we talked a few times. Very, very smart guy. Okay. Oh, what do you talk about? I think baking soda as pre-workout. I've used it. I've used it with CrossFit athletes. Funny because I was training this guy that made the CrossFit Games, and people were accusing him of taking baking soda as a sports performance and agent before WODs. Yeah, but it's legal. It's not banned or anything. But yeah, it does buffer lactate and the acidification of the muscle milieu. It does have to be timed properly. So you cannot take it too close to the event because it can actually cause stomach disturbances. People just don't tolerate it well. But if you have the dose right, and the timing right, it can really, really help when it comes to tolerating lactate. But in that case, it's not tolerant. It's just that you will uh, make the muscle milieu and the blood less acidic even when the lactate is released because uh, baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, is alkalinizing salt. All right, guys, that's all the time I have today. Sorry if my performance was a bit less good than it would be normally, more stuttering. I would actually put that on the fact that I had a strength and power workout this morning and only had like 30 minutes doing that workout and presenting. So my brain is kind of in a brain fog state. Hopefully, it was not too noticeable. But I promise you that next week I will be better, or rather, I'll be less bad. Hopefully, you can show up and ask again.